If you have questions today, put them in the chat, raise your hand, or you can always email us at youalreadyownit@go-planet.com. For more information about today's program and some of the past blogs and cloud office hour recordings, be sure to check out the newsletter. If you're not getting the newsletter, please reach out to YouAlreadyOwnIt@go-planet.com to get onboarded to the program or added to the email list. Also, be sure to check out the useful links at the end of the deck of the presentation. And yes, this link, a link to this presentation and recording will be available in a follow-up email. So feel free to share it with your colleagues. With that said, just a quick warning, we're now going to get started and record the session. Welcome. Today we'll be discussing Microsoft Fabric, Enterprise Data Estate Analytics Made Easy. We will talk about some of the new updated information since Miguel last discussed Fabric back in June of 2023. And discuss the benefits and why you might want to consider using Fabric with Power BI. So with me today is Miguel Wood, who is our principal data architect here at Planet. If you're a frequent attendee of this program, you probably recognize Miguel as our resident data savant and previous presenter on topics like modernizing enterprise data analytics, enable unified data governance across all your data resources with Azure Purview, modernizing data estate with Microsoft Enterprise Data Strategy, and cost savings using Azure SQL hybrid benefits. Most recently, Miguel has been working with Azure OpenAI with Microsoft and our customers. Just a reminder, if you have missed any of those sessions that Miguel has spoken on, they're all available, recordings and available just for the asking. So please reach out to your account executive or cloud strategist. So, Miguel, we're so glad you're with us on the program today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Ken. As always, it's always good to be here for You Already Own It.
Yeah, I love having you back. So for today's agenda, we'll start with data estate challenges, then move into data estate architectures. We'll give an overview of Microsoft Fabric to include licensing, everyone's favorite topic, right? And there's definitely some new information there to be shared. Deployment patterns, capacity management, common scenarios, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for Miguel to do a quick demo of what Fabric looks like and how it integrates with Power BI. And of course, we'll save time for questions and feedback. So let's get started. Miguel, talk to us a little bit about the challenges organizations are having with enterprise data analytics solutions and how Fabric can possibly help.
You know, that they're having the same challenges small organizations actually have with large organizations, and that is that data is siloed. You know, if you think about even a small to medium organization or agency, one of the things you think about is you've got application platforms residing for serving each one of those parts of the organization. This poses a challenge not only for sharing information or using information between those departments or silos or applications or platforms, but also from a enterprise data governance perspective also creates challenges. We don't know what we have out there. There are obviously some solutions. We'll even talk about the integration of Microsoft Purview data governance a little bit later on. That's embedded straight into Fabric as well. I think the big thing that people are probably that they have the issue around and the challenges they're having for the analytics is how do I get to the data that I need to report on that and then make obviously decisions proactively rather than just on the reacting to or reporting on that information as well. So one of the things that is occurring is within those organizations is all these many questions, and these are just a couple of those questions. So how do I ensure that this data, which is arguably in any organization, our data is probably the most important asset we have. How do I very quickly get to that data and actually analyze that data? You know, in the old days, and I say old days, just several years ago, most of us were dealing with data warehouses. And you think about data warehouses. We had to basically take all these disparate data sources and transform that data and then load it into typically a fixed schema. And that model that we've dealt with for decades has been that extract, transform, and load, or ETL model. Well, obviously we have moved over or shifted into this ELT, where we want to get that data, make it available to the people that need to have it, at the same time governing and securing that data so that they only have access to the data that they need to. So that ELT model now, I'm not worried about having to set up this schematized or structured data structure for a data warehouse. I am looking to looking to make that agile. And this is where we get into data lakes, lake houses, and making that available. And you'll see that even from the ground up, that Fabric has been, from an enterprise data management or access and usability perspective, has already brought that to bear. Again, I can't stress security and governance, and how do I ensure that I'm not making it spending way too much money to provide that functionality to our users within our environment. And I guess I'll go ahead and say next slide then for you, Ken, because I know you're driving it over here.
Yeah.
So what is Microsoft Fabric? Well, first off, I think the first thing you want to look at is most people have been introduced to Fabric by simply using Power BI. If you've got Power BI, you probably opened up Power BI before, and you'll notice down in the lower left-hand corner that you typically have a little icon, and you have sometimes that availability to see that. In fact, when you go to Power BI app, you'll notice it's not the Power BI logo that's popping up and giving you that little toast. It's actually the Fabric, that green F logo. Within Fabric, we basically have what we call experiences. Think of those as areas of concentration of functionality that my users may or may not need to get to. Most users are going to think from a Power BI, that's visualization. But users now have the capability of getting to and very quickly, easily creating some of these things that were arguably very complex to do. If we go back a year, 2 years, Synapse, I'd have to go to the Azure portal. I'd have to go get all these capacities and everything else. So it became very, very difficult for me to create either warehouses or Spark pools and other things to get to that. Also, I want to be able to react to, or maybe have, if something happens to my data, I may want an event to kick off. And that's kind of where we get into something that most people may not even recognize, something that's relatively new in Fabric called Data Activator. And that's exactly what that does, is it reacts to events within our data estate. And so that's kind of where you start with. And in fact, if you take a look inside of Fabric, and we'll get into that later on, you'll see each of these experiences as an option to jump in there. And that has a landing page, and even no matter how long you've been using it, starting points or quick starts to be able to create some of these things, whether that be Data Factory based off of Azure Data Factory. And the interesting thing is all these things, except for Power BI and arguably Data Activator, they're all going to be still compute resources. So the backend compute is actually Azure. So we see this crossover between Microsoft 365 Power BI or the Power Platform and the Azure compute capabilities. Next slide, please.
Yeah, what I love is the fact that this is all home based now. It's all one place to go find all this stuff, as opposed to going to find it inside of Azure separately. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's one of the things. And so when I'm explaining this, and I think when I've done some analytics and done Synapse before, Synapse was meant to also be that single pane of glass to get to anything that would be enterprise analytics capabilities. But I had to do that typically through the Azure portal. Yes, there was a web front end, if you will, a studio or a workspace, Synapse workspace, but most of the time that was going to be limited to just the data engineers, the data scientists, and or your infrastructure guys. So it was kind of I arguably say that Fabric is kind of that next version of Synapse, but because it includes everyone within the organization, including your users. So because of that, I wanted to make sure you kind of understand what this starts with. Now I'm going to hold off on Purview for just a second, but the first thing that you need to understand is that a Fabric tenant, and they use that term tenant when they're describing it from Microsoft documentation, is mapped one-to-one to your tenant, your Entra ID tenant. So you will not have more than one Fabric tenants per Entra ID or Azure Active Directory tenant. What's also very important is that each tenant, Fabric tenant or Entra ID tenant, by default, no matter what, has a one lake. And that one lake is like a shared data lake or lake house within the entire organization. Now, everyone's going to start freaking out because, oh my goodness, how do I ensure that it's secure and everything else? It is exactly, when I'm explaining this to new users, think of it as OneDrive. You do not have, for instance, if you have Microsoft 365, you have one OneDrive for the entire organization. It doesn't mean that everyone has access to everyone else's OneDrive. The same thing is with OneLake. In fact, there's even an app that just like you have your OneDrive app on your desktops or on your machines, there is a OneLake app that provides access to all of your workspaces and your things that you have access to within your organization. So OneLake is mapped directly to a Fabric tenant, one-to-one, and a Fabric tenant is mapped directly one-to-one to an Entra ID or Azure Active Directory tenant. So that is the basis there. Above that is where we actually sit. One thing that's sitting in right in between this OneLake and what we see our experiences there is something called capacity. And capacities, because all of these resources, albeit except for Power BI, are really built inside of Azure, we literally have capacities. Now, we'll get into the licensing here in a few minutes on kind of, we have two different ways of purchasing those capacities or having that capacity, but I can have more than one capacity and multiple capacities within a tenant. So that's where it breaks the one-to-one model, is at the capacity, which is that think of it as that sitting between the OneLake and where you see these experiences on the slide of data integration or data engineering or data warehouse. What I've also done on this slide is specified what you're seeing as far as the back-end technologies that Fabric, as a SaaS application, if you will, is exposing and or creating or managing on your behalf through the Fabric interaction or UI. And so that's kind of where we need to sit. Now, I do want to mention Purview. So Purview is, if you're not familiar with it, Microsoft Purview is the all-encompassing, both the old Microsoft 365 compliance capabilities, but also the Azure Purview, which became Microsoft Purview data governance side. And most organizations that really kind of try to get into the data governance with Azure Purview or Microsoft Purview data governance, it became it is kind of a, I'm not going to lie, it can be a daunting experience because you've got to have all of that. What Fabric has done is also brought the Microsoft Purview data governance component into it to allow for you to classify and label your data no matter where it sits. And so that's a very, very powerful functionality. It's currently still in preview, and you'll see that when we get to the demo. But it's an all-encompassing kind of single pane of glass for all of your data within your organization.
And if you're confused, don't worry. We're going to break this all down for you in the next few slides. So hang tight, buckle your seatbelts. We're going to try to make it easy. Remember, that was the title of this session. So we're going to break it down for you. Here we go.
So again, when I kind of start thinking about this whole organization of that Fabric tenant, and I've put here lake or lake house or data lake. Now I have, if you remember from the previous slide, we've got the Fabric tenant that is bound one-to-one with the OneLake, the tenant OneLake, and then we have above that capacities. Now, when I create workspaces, by default, you have your own personal workspace. In fact, even if you don't have a capacity and you're just dealing with a Power BI Pro, your workspace is built and put into a capacity that's there from your Power BI licensing. But the workspaces can be bound to a capacity. Remember, capacities, I can have more than one per tenant. In fact, a lot of organizations that are deploying Fabric successfully are going to have a capacity per department or capacity per workload. And that's important to understand. So that workspace, then, I can go ahead and use those. And just like anything else, I am able to secure that with RBAC, again, based off of Entra ID or Azure Active Directory on my users, and even share that out as well. So the idea with that workspace, then within that, I can have different types of the objects, the lake houses or the data sets or the warehouse or the custos, i.e. logging and so forth, folders within that workspace. The workspace is not limited to one single experience. So it's again, I'm trying to make sure you understand this hierarchical, and we'll get into this when we get to deployment models of Fabric within organizations as well. Go ahead and next slide then. So now I'm going to kind of, again, this is one of the reasons I'm spending so much time on this, is because this is where I'm seeing customers struggle in understanding this relationship between Power BI, between Fabric, between Azure, between Synapse, and all these things we see available to us within Fabric. So if you think about the compute resources, again, my capacities are what my compute resources are sitting on top of that that tenant. That is my compute resources. However, they are, what you need to understand is they're serverless, meaning they're on demand. So I have the ability to basically spin these things up and do it as a serverless capability. I think the other way you might want to think about this is, for instance, if I buy capacity, and say I buy an F64, and we'll get into those numbers here in just a minute, which kind of maps identically to the old Power BI Premium P1 capacity, dedicated capacity. I have these resources can be shared across workspaces, and then I'm able to then go ahead and place those workspaces or assign those workspaces to that as well. So when I take a look at my OneLake has these files, right? My Parquet files. It's a lake house or a data lake, and it's built, by the way, on Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So it is truly a data lake. But those things are going to, depending on what I'm using or what experiences I'm using, they may literally have a link down to that folder that I talked about in the previous slide. So the example I always like to use is a data warehouse. That's what most people think about. Normally with a data warehouse, I'm going to be querying it against SQL, but that is going to be stored not necessarily in a database, but in a Delta Parquet format within my OneLake. The OneLake could be within my personal workspace, or it could be in a capacity where I'm actually using it, the capacity with the workspaces that have been assigned to that capacity. So that is, again, I'm not going to get into all of these just right now. We'll talk about those briefly in when we get to our scenarios a little bit later on. Next slide, please, Ken.
Okay.
All right. So now, because people are confused, for instance, if you're not aware, you can't buy a Power BI Premium licensing. But what I've done is I've basically consolidated a couple things from the Microsoft documentation, which it's sometimes a struggle to get that information out there. I wanted to basically specify your new Fabric SKUs and what they're bound to. They are bound or measured by what's known as capacity units, CUs. Okay. So what I then did was I went and got your Power BI, your old Power BI SKUs. Some of them are still valid, but Power BI SKUs. And what I'm looking at is the P. The A's, by the way, and you got embedded in the A's, those are special types of Power BI. But then I have how many vCores or Power BI vCores that would kind of map to if that was the case. So the one that I would actually highlight, and Ken, if you could, take a look at F64. That's the SKU. Now this is where it's going to confuse people when they're, no worries. When it'll confuse people because most people were looking at the, it
was the P1 in the past, yeah.
P1 Premium, right? Power BI Premium. We did get a Power BI Premium per user, a PPU. Guys, that was just the precursor to Fabric.
Yeah.
Because we do have that, right? But when I start getting to the capacities, and by the way, if you have a P1, that's going to move strictly over to an F64 or above. P2 would do an F120, F128, etc. So that, and those, by the way, that SKU number is bound to what the number of capacity units are. Okay. What I also wanted to do, because most people are coming from a Power BI background when they're looking at Fabric, at least initially, is I wanted to show the capabilities between the free version of Power BI, the Pro version of Power BI, and that's that either included in your Microsoft 365, E5, A5, G5, or your Power BI Premium per user, like the PPU. And so if you'll notice, the closest thing you actually have there to almost all of them is going to either be at the Pro level or the PPU level. The only difference between Pro and PPU was, remember, PPU was able to create premium workspaces, think capacity workspaces, and the Pro was able to actually share non-Power BI Fabric items. So that's the only difference there. This is actually the Fabric capabilities based on the Power BI capabilities or your Power BI licensing. And I wanted to make sure that was clear because this is another area that most people, when they're first getting into Fabric, just get confused with, okay? And the pricing is out there. The pricing, I will be honest, the pricing for an F64 is a little bit more than the P1 was before. Remember, P1 was dedicated just to Power BI. Now with the Fabric, you have all the capabilities, all these other Azure things as well. Whereas before, I would have to go purchase those and configure those and integrate those with my Power BI Premium capacity that I had before. That's why
That's
you
a big
see that
difference. Yeah,
price.
that's a big
That's a
difference.
huge thing. So just again, make sure we kind of have this understanding around the licensing and the capacity. Next slide, please.
And well, before we leave this
Oh yeah,
slide, Mike,
yeah.
I know I'm gonna make sure we have time for the demo, but really quick question, well, not comment, right? So before the minimum you could buy was P1, right? And so now you've got all these lesser SKUs for maybe some smaller work situations, right? Use cases. So that's a new addition
Yes,
as well.
yes, it is. You see that embedded at the F8, F16, and F32. Remember, embedded and your other were for special, special situations. Those embedded, the EM and the A1 Power BI SKUs don't translate directly over to Fabric because they're simply solely Power BI. So that is
Gotcha.
still available.
Okay.
But yes, so even for I have multiple demo tenants, right? I have a Microsoft 365 E5 tenant that I use for my work, my demo work and learning and so forth. And then I also have another personal one that I've only got an F2 capacity license for. But it's interesting, even with that F2, and I've actually kicked it up to F4, going back and forth on that, I'm going to get to something that's very, very interesting that allows for me to actually get and utilize capacity even up to the 64 level, even though I only have an F2. I'm going to get to that in just a few minutes. So
Sounds good.
there's a lot around this. I
And
think
if you
this
have
is where you
questions,
see.
yeah, if you have questions, put them in the chat window, and we'll try to get to them at the end about the licensing. I know it's confusing, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. Again, knowing where people are coming from, primarily the majority of people are coming from. There may be people coming from the Azure Synapse world as well. All right, so how do I purchase these quote unquote capacities, these capacity units, this licensing? There's two ways of looking at it. One is typically the kicker here is going to be the SKU or the pay as you go is the Azure model. So basically at that point, I'm paying for capacity, but I'm paying for it as you go, just like I would anything else. Think of that as cores. And so there's no time commitment. You actually you can scale it up and down through the Azure portal. You get the cost management concepts from your capacities, even though, again, people confuse that because we're kind of crossing that boundary between Microsoft 365 or the Power Platform and the Azure. You get all of the capabilities of monitoring, administration, everything else for that capacity within Azure if you go down that path. There is going to be the ability to do reservations like I am as well. So even though this is a pay-as-you-go by default, if I commit, for instance, to a Fabric capacity for 1 year or 3 years, that's where we get our reservations from, then you are going to see a lower cost in your capacity licensing, if you will.
Nice.
Remember, capacity licensing is not bound to users. So I want to be clear here. Whereas when I look at it from the Microsoft 365, just like when I would buy Power BI Pro licenses or PPU license, premium per user license, those are bound to the user, right? To the Entra ID user that's assigned to. So that is another way to get to the Fabric functionality. A PPU user would actually have all the Fabric capabilities. Now, the challenge they're going to run into, however, is when I start going over capacity or doing something in a workspace that may go over the capacity of, say, an F2 or an F4, right? Then you may actually run into struggles there. Remember, the EM and the A SKUs do not support Microsoft. The embedded SKUs don't support Microsoft Fabric. They're dedicated to Power BI. Okay. Next one. Oh, one thing. Could you go back really quick? For those people who are using Synapse or Synapse Analytics, that you will be able to, and you're making the shift to Fabric, which is includes more than just obviously just Synapse. You will have the ability. There's a little note on that last bullet, the first part, the ability to exchange the Azure Synapse Analytics reserved capacity for a fabric capacity reservation as well. So be aware that that investment is not lost. I'm not going to tell you what Microsoft was doing as far as if you know, they were basically gave you grandfathered you in if you purchased your premium capacity prior to the new fiscal year or before, you know, June 30th. Next slide. Okay, so the last little piece on licensing. This is it, guys. I wanted to kind of say the workspace license mode on the left-hand side. That first column, I've got a Power BI Pro, a PPU, I've got the premium per capacity, that's those P SKUs. Then I have the embedded SKUs and the A SKUs and the EM SKUs, and then the fabric capacity. The trial, of course, is a 60-day trial, and you'll see this when we get into the demo. But that provides for all of the fabric experiences. So on the far right column, it shows what the supported experiences within the fabric is. For Pro and Premium PPU, you're just getting Power BI experience. For the premium capacities or the F series, now we're going to get all fabric experiences. So that's the third line or the third row and the fifth row. That's when I get all fabric experiences. Obviously, a trial includes all of them as well.
Gotcha.
So.
Okay, let's see how this looks now in reality.
Well, let's go. Yeah, and we will. So what are the fabric deployment patterns? So there's technically 4. I'm going to cover 3 and I'll mention the 4th one because it's typically an edge case scenario or for extremely large organizations that are going to deal with it. So the first one is a monolithic. And what that means is I've got a fabric tenant. Remember, fabric tenant is the same as the Entra ID tenant. And I've got a single capacity, a fabric capacity. Inside that capacity, I have multiple workspaces or a single workspace. And those are all being backed by the OneLake, the fabric tenant OneLake. So I've kind of made sure that this shows the relationship between the fabric tenant and OneLake, one-to-one, and then a single fabric capacity that has 1 or more workspaces in it, okay? And those workspaces can have different experience assets that are there and associated with the OneLake. The multiple workspaces backed by a single fabric capacity. So most of your small and medium organizations, this is what they're going to have. They're going to have a fabric tenant associated with one OneLake, and then multiple workspaces associated with the OneLake for the asset storage, and different ones as well. So this is primarily your small and medium organizations. Most enterprises, however, if you'll go to the next slide, are going to be dealing with or probably going to deploy a pattern where they're going to have multiple fabric capacities. And those can be different SKUs, different sizes, if you will. And they could be then also the capacities, because they're capacities in Azure from a billing perspective, could be associated with either a separate department, a project, or other. And then those things, obviously, just like any other capacity, can have 1 or more workspaces associated with it. Again, those assets, however, are all stored in the single OneLake. Now, again, do not think that just because they're being stored in OneLake that anyone with access to OneLake can get to those other things. Again, think of that type of access the same as your OneDrive access from a Microsoft 365 perspective. Okay, this is going to be what I see enterprises truly going into this model. It allows for us to build back to different departments, different projects, etc. Those workspace, those capacities within those fabric capacities are being built inside of Fabric. Now, the one other thing, so I mentioned, again, it's a 1-to-1 mapping of the fabric tenant to the Entra ID tenant and the fabric tenant to OneLake. 1-to-1-to-1, if you think of it that way. So what would be the only other possibility? I may have multiple tenants, multiple Entra ID tenants. We see this in some of our government agencies. We also see this in international organizations where they have tenants for different parts of the world, especially from a GDPR perspective, or other things. At that point, yes, I could technically have that fabric capacity. When there is no turning on OneLake, if you will, but you do specify in the workspace what region you're going to put that in. And so if I start crossing large geos, especially crossing where I need to be concerned with compliance and regulatory compliance and data residency compliance, that may be the case where I would have a multiple tenant, i.e. multiple fabric tenants and multiple capacities within those tenants as well. That's kind of an edge scenario, which is why I did not do a diagram on that, but I do want to call that out. That's obviously quite capable as well. All right, next slide, please. All right, this is something I'm excited about. This was just announced at the end of last year. So one of the challenges we've had with, and in fact, I've dealt with clients just recently over the last couple of months, where they have a Power BI premium, and during certain times they have gone past or see that their Power BI compute has been exceeding their capacity that they have in Power BI. What Fabric has is, first of all, two things. I'll go ahead and quickly say, you have the ability, just like you do for most compute resources in Azure, not all, but most, the ability to pause and resume capabilities. Remember, your compute costs in Azure are based on when you're using them. So if I pause something like a VM, I've got to be careful, pause or deallocate, I am not being charged anything for that other than the storage for the images, right? That's the same with also for some of your PaaS services. I can stop them or pause them and then resume them. So I have the capability of doing that with Fabric capacities. But what we also have that is very important is something called bursting and smoothing. So what this is the ability when I'm running a job, typically a scheduled job, and that job needs excessive or beyond the capacity units for that job, it'll go ahead and give it to you, let you use it. Now, there are some things that will happen if you do this for a long time, and I'm going to get into that. And again, it's typically 24 hours. But what will happen is that job runs for 10, 15 minutes, and you no longer need those capacities, and it drops down below your threshold, your 64 CUs, for instance, in this animated diagram. What it'll do is then try and reclaim, or what we call smooth. And so it allows for you to basically borrow compute power, capacity units, and then return them when you're not using the full capacity right after, okay? The challenge with this would be is if I'm always using 64 CUs and I go above that, that's when you're going to start seeing some things on and saying, hey, you need to go ahead and scale that up. But I also want to let you know what happens if you abuse this, or what happens if you take this in for too long. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. Again, the reported CU is on a 24-hour basis, so that's what you're going to see that. So if the users are less than 10 minutes, your platform policy is called overage protection. Nothing. Jobs can consume 10 minutes of future capacity without any type of throttling whatsoever. Okay. If it goes between 10 minutes and 60 minutes, what you'll see is the interactive delay. This is very, very important that you understand. That's the user requested interactive types. They will be throttled. They won't be stopped. They won't be rejected, but you'll see a what's the word I'm looking for? A reduction in your performance. It's being throttled at that time, okay? If it goes from 60 minutes to that 24-hour hard line, then you are going to start seeing user requested interactive types, user requested, again, not the scheduled jobs perspective or background jobs. Those will be rejected. Now, if it's greater than 24 hours, that's the time when you'll see these background jobs, those critical things start being rejected from execution. So there is a significant amount of monitoring, not only from a Fabric perspective in the admin portal and notifications and so forth, but don't forget these capacities are typically sitting in Azure. So you have all of your capabilities of monitor and everything else to be able to monitor this as well. Believe me, you'll get notified, okay? I just want to make sure you kind of understand that throttling and or finally background rejection, rejected from execution. Go next slide, please. All right, let's get into our data roles, right? Our data roles are data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and data citizens. I don't like data citizens. I just think end users. So the idea behind this is what are the experiences that would support these roles. Again, from a data stewards are going to basically be looking at both of these. They're the ones that are taking a look at the costs and the governance perspective from like a purview perspective. But be aware that these also may be interacting with each other. Hence, really the big benefit of having that one lake behind the scenes. I could have a workspace that's going to have all of these different experiences that the data engineers could then pass to the data analysts or to the data scientists and so forth. And then, of course, the users being able to go ahead and place that, utilize Power BI, and then embed that in Microsoft 365 functionality. I'm not going to read these things, but again, just some very quick. So what I want to do next is kind of go through just some of your, or provide you with some of those scenarios, and then let's get to a demo, because I think that's what most people want to see. So the common analytics scenarios, and what I've done is I've created a slide for each one of these four. This is not all of them, but this is the most common ones. This is a lakehouse, a data warehouse, data science, and real-time analytics. Again, kind of streaming IoT, think logs, those kind of things. Next slide, please. From a lakehouse perspective, pretty straightforward. When you see the data source, shortcut enabled and or structured and unstructured, those could be stored in my OneLake or coming from outside. I ingest those things, and then they're being placed or stored in a lakehouse. Remember, this is an ELT situation, right? So I'm extracting, loading, and then as needed, when my users need a information, I may transform that in the lakehouse and even push that out to a lake warehouse. Again, it's some terminology. It's not like we don't use lake for everything, but when we're talking about lakes, we're not talking about, we're still talking structured data, but we're typically talking Parquet files and so forth. Next slide, please. Data warehouse is what most people think, and we typically think ETL, or extract, transform, and load. Again, we're still going to do that from the data sources to ingesting, and typically those are going to have pipelines. Think Data Factory here, and those are going to go move into a data warehouse. But we do start thinking from a data warehouse, especially if I'm going to be doing it in Parquet files. I can transform those things on the fly, and even ultimately place it in a true data warehouse with a transform after it's hit that quote unquote data warehouse of our lake house. Next. Data science, and this is where we start talking about Spark analytics and so forth. And we're using notebooks of different types. Spark has the ability to use multiple types. So I have my data source being a lake house and or a data warehouse. I'm going to clean and prepare it with notebooks, store it in a lake house, and then I can do some really interesting things. Again, train, test, and apply. This is where I start getting into using machine language or AI, and I'm not talking OpenAI, multiple AI things. If you've been out to Azure AI Studio lately, you know that we have 1,800 different models to choose from in the Microsoft ecosystem. So that is, a lot of this is then I can expose this and utilize it against any type of those models from an AI perspective, or AML or Azure machine learning, or other types of machine learning. And of course, either also expose that via Power BI. Last one, I think I had the real-time analytics. And this is what I'm talking about, event streaming and or IoT from my data coming in. Yes, I can still bring that in from lake houses and structured, unstructured, and or a machine learning model, and bring that in and then place that in and I don't like that CustoDB. In fact, I would say, yes, it can go into CustoDB. Think of that as your log analytics, but maybe I want to mirror that so I can capture that and look for things. This is when I'm looking at the pipelines and data flows, so I can literally get to near real-time analytics. I know they call it real-time. I'm an engineer, so I'm never going to say real-time, or have that caveat. So again, fairly straightforward. Typically with these types of things, we're using KQL or Custo queries. So next slide, please. All right, I think I'm going to mention this very quickly. Yes, Fabric does have, imagine that, a co-pilot. Not only we don't have hundreds already, but so this, of course, allows for you to interact with it with native language, right? Native language processing, and generate all of these assets via Copilot, so that I don't have to learn how to do DAX queries, or I don't have to worry about converting this into OpenAI. You can even create and customize these Copilots and even make it a heck of a lot better. I want to call that out because we're seeing that people are going, oh my gosh, how am I going to learn about ADF? How am I going to learn about whatever? DAX is the easiest one to think about, because a lot of people, I want to create a Power BI report. I know what the visuals look like, but I have no idea how I need to query that. This is where your Copilot can come in handy. Well, you can also do that with Data Factory. You can do that with a data warehouse. You can do that with a data lake, etc. So this is something that you probably need to examine if you may not have the deep technical skills to get into the nuts and bolts of some of these assets that we have available to us within Fabric. All right, I think this is where we're going to jump into the demo, right?
Yep, I believe so. We got about 15 minutes left, so if you could do maybe a 10-minute demo,
I'm going to
maybe 5 minutes. Yep.
I'm going to do two things. I'm going to show what it looks like from a user's experience from within Planet. I'm not going to expose any of our data, so don't worry if anyone's out there going, oh my goodness, is he really going to do this? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll bring that up. So I am in my my Planet browser. So I'm logged in with my Planet account. I'm going to just simply do powerbi.com. And this is me going to go get my apps. Notice the Fabric right here. There's that Fabric icon. It's not Power BI, it's Fabric. But I am, if you'll look down here in the lower left-hand corner, I am in Power BI. So I have all of the things up here, but what I also have up here is my workspaces, the workspaces within that. I see all my reports I have access to, etc. Now you'll notice right now, this one is I'm under a Fabric trial for 10 days left. I have the ability to go and create additional workspaces, but if I click on this, I can actually see all the other workspaces. If I create a new workspace, I can then go ahead, and by the way, I'm going to talk about this domain here. This is something that is brand spanking new. I am able to now organize my assets and workspaces, not just, remember the compute is the capacity. This is my logical organization. I'm able to create domains, and there are no domains yet created in this tenant. I have some advanced pieces. Who's the owner? Who the contact list? And then what is my license mode that I want to do? Right? This is important. If I had specific premium capacities or I had Fabric capacities, I would be able to specify what capacity that was. If there was more than one I have access to, I may not have access to the ones that we have here. And then I have whether I'm going to use a small semantic model storage format or large. Large is going to be enterprise-wide. A couple other things I would actually say is notice endorsements, notice sensitivity. That's your purview piece here. When it was opened, what the type is. So I see the object type and the location of where it's at as well. Okay. Now, if I wanted to, I could come up here and take a look at my settings. And this is what it looks like if I go to an admin portal where I'm not an admin. So I'm going to jump over the admin portal, and you'll notice it's loading this, and I have really nothing. I've got all my different types of capacities. I have different types of information right here on my personal workspace, and of course, that's all I have. There is my OneLake Data Hub, by the way. So if I click on this, I'm able to see all of the OneLake within the organization, and there's obviously some information here, semantic models, etc., that I have access to within Planet. Now this is Planet. This is where I'm acting as a user. All right. Now I'm going to go ahead and take you over to one where I am an admin. So first of all, I could still do the go to Power BI, and I'm going to, if I were to go ahead and create a new window, let's go ahead and do, I'll forget it. New window and go to Power BI. Obviously, it's going to take me to the Power BI, but you'll notice the address here, or the app, is app.fabric.microsoft.com/home. And these are all my different experiences I've talked about, right? Power BI, Synapse, etc. If I come down to my Microsoft Fabric, I can then go to any one of those different experiences. This will take me right back over here. If I take a look at my Power BI, same thing I had before, but what I also wanted to show you is this is the Purview Hub. So I'm actually looking at the Microsoft Purview Hub. This is again in preview, but I'm able to get to all of the different elements from an enterprise governance, data governance. That means sensitivity labels, endorsements, which means this is a trusted source or trusted one, the new domains functionality, and even browse through those items as well, depending on what I have access to, right? So this is extremely critical, primarily around the Microsoft Purview data governance, but it does obviously bring in stuff from the Microsoft Purview on the 365 side, i.e. sensitivity labels. Last thing I'm going to go ahead and do is show you what it looks like when I go to the admin portal. So I'm going to open that link in a new browser window tab. And I wanted to show you what the capabilities are and what I have ability to see. So I am literally on the tenant settings, right? And if you'll take a look, if you don't think you have enough tenant settings to go to, there is, all right? Capacity, additional workflows, Copilot and Azure OpenAI service, all of these things that I can bind in there. There are, as new capabilities come down, Power BI visuals, just looking at the different headings, integration settings, I am able to control all of this from the admin. That domains I was talking about that's brand spanking new, if I wanted to create a domain, I can go ahead and create a new domain. Maybe I want to say this is going to be a sales domain. And who are the admins? Well, I'm going to make that myself. And there we go. And I go ahead and create that. And now that's available. And I can see all the, by the way, there is a subdomains as well. So I can create subdomains. And this is the default domain for a security group, for instance, or an Entra-ID group. So all of that's available. By the way, I was just looking at the tenant settings. You've got all your usage metrics, PPU, remember, because they still have access to it. Identities, it is very, very robust in the administration and management of that as well. What I didn't show, and I'll show the last little thing, let me just jump over to say data engineering. Let me do data warehouse. That's going to be most common. Once you go to any one of these experiences, you have not only star points, but it is ridiculous. I don't have to be a DBA to go ahead and create a data warehouse or a mirrored Azure SQL database. I can literally go ahead and click on warehouse, give the workspace a name, click create, and I've got that up to, unable to create the admin workspace, my workspace, because your org is free. It's not in the same region as workspace capacity. There's one of the things that I've actually done is I'm in a different region. So I would have to stand up a free Microsoft Fabric trial here in the right region. So that's one thing, but just to kind of show that out. That's all I've got. You can go ahead and take back over, unless there's any questions before I leave.
Yeah, let's ask any questions. Come off mute or ask question in the chat window. We got about 9 minutes left as we're wrapping up here. And if you want to go ahead and throw your questions in, regardless if we run out of time, we'll definitely answer them afterwards, follow-up emails or whatever, set up a call. But happy to answer your questions. I'm going to leave it in the live demo for a second here until a few more seconds, and then we'll move on to just wrap things up here.
By the way, if you take a look at this data engineering, I just jumped over that experience. You've got notebooks, Spark notebooks, environments, lake houses, data pipelines, etc. So
very good. Doesn't look like we have any questions. Okay, so let me go ahead and take back over to do the wrap up here.
Roger that.
Okay, so obviously lots of information today, lots of things to learn about. We've tried to put together some links here for you all. So if you're just getting started, definitely check these out. There's a Microsoft Learn here. That's a great way to get up to speed quickly. And then if you're already an experienced user and you want to stay up on the latest and greatest information, they have a nice blog here. Definitely start following that blog on it. They put out information on a monthly basis. So definitely worth bookmarking that and checking back there on a regular basis. We'll pause again here for questions. Are there any questions at all? In fact, Casey, go ahead and turn off the recording if you want. If somebody wants to come off, we'd love to hear about your experiences with Fabric, good, bad, or indifferent. Would love to hear about what you're doing with Fabric, possibly. If you want to share, we'd love to hear about it. Feel free to come off mute. Looks like Sharon Bailey, maybe. Not sure if they have a question. Can you use Python integrated into the transformation process? Miguel?
Absolutely. Think of that from a Spark perspective. Yep.
Good. Okay. Got it. Okay, cool. Any other questions? This was a lot of information. Stay with us just a few more minutes. We want to make sure that you're aware of some workshops and things we have available for you for free. So feel free to put questions in as we finish wrapping up the session. We got about 7 more minutes, and we'll definitely stay on until 2 o'clock. Okay. So just would love to hear about your feedback, 1 to 5, whether this is useful or not. If you could, I don't know if the polls are working yet again, but if you could just go ahead and put it in the chat window, that'd be awesome. Save the date. The next You Already Own It Cloud Office Hours is going to be August 22nd. We hope that you come and join us. And if you have a topic that you wish to hear more about, please shoot us an email as well. Just another reminder, if you're not getting the monthly emails and haven't been onboarded yet, please reach out to your account team. It takes about 30 minutes to get onboarded or less. And we go over all the benefits that you'll see here on this slide. We have over 20 different benefits that are free for the asking, so please reach out to your account team. I wanted to highlight this last column over here. A lot of the things we talked about today, we go into details. Miguel does a lot of these himself. Data estate modernization is all about like getting your SQL servers moved to Azure in a PaaS solution. Talk about some cost reductions there possibly for you and some freeing up of resources, why you'd want to do it, that kind of thing. Data analytics modernization, we talk about Azure Synapse and talk about an intro to Fabric. Enterprise data governance, we start exploring the Azure Purview and cataloging your data. Next up, we talk about Microsoft Fabric and Power BI workshop. Covers a lot about what we discovered today. If you're interested in a follow-up on this conversation, please reach out to us. And then finally, Azure OpenAI utilization. If you're thinking about doing anything with Azure OpenAI, reach out to us. I don't know, Miguel, if you wanted to add anything else or if there was a question.
I would say that last one, we're in the process of kind of redoing that a little bit. OpenAI will be the focus, but as I mentioned about the 1,800 models we have in Azure AI Studio, we're kind of growing that out a little bit because a lot of that is, we initially had Azure OpenAI Studio. Now we have Azure AI Studio that allows access to all these other models. I mean,
gotcha.
Not just LLMs, but also small language models as well.
Lots going on there, so constantly refining what we're doing here. Thanks, Miguel. All right. With that said, we're going to go ahead and leave the session open for the next 5 minutes. If there's questions that you have, again, Miguel, Casey, if you want to turn off the recording, that'd be awesome. This way people can ask their questions freely without being recorded, possibly. On behalf of Planet Technologies, I want to thank Miguel and, of course, all of you for joining us today. If you're interested in making the move or having a discussion on Fabric, please reach out to your account team. And that's pretty much a wrap. And we hope to see you next office hours on August 22nd. We hope you have a great day. And again, we're going to stay tuned here for the next 4 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to come off mute or just ask away.
Thank you all. Appreciate it for your time today.
Yeah, thanks.